Social and ethical issues, access to data, ownership, and control. So, with these issues we're talking about today, and you can see it's kind of threefold, we're talking about these three elements of access, ownership, and control, and they all essentially relate to the permissions both users and participants have in relation to the information stored on an information system. Just because data is stored on a business's system does not mean everyone who works for that business should be able to access that data. So let's break down these three terms and obviously see how that relates to the actual accessing of this data of the system. The first one is access, and that is the right users have to view specific information, both users and participants. Do they have the right to view everything on the system? Secondly, is ownership. Who owns that information on the system? Is it the business? Is it the researcher who found that data? Or is it the individual whom that information is all about? Now, depending on system to system, any of three of those answers could be correct, depending on what the system is about and whether permission has been given by certain parties to have that information on the system. Okay, so this is where it really alludes to that there's a lot of gray area in this actual issue where it may need to be clarified by a business what's going on and who has access and obviously the ownership of this information. And then finally, with this information on the system, is the control element. What essentially can the user or participant do with this information, such as editing it, sharing it, or deleting the data that's stored on it? And should every user on that system have that right? Definitely not at all. Usually it's reserved for administrators, okay, with that level of control. But obviously, users should have some way of interacting with the system. So, what can they and can't do, okay? The most simplest way to think about this as well is when you create your own Google Doc and you share it with people. You can say they can just view the information. You could say they can just comment on the information that's written there, or you might actually give them full editing privileges that allow them to actually change the document itself. So that kind of illustrates what's going on here. And obviously, systems themselves usually have large amounts of data stored on them, which may be private and stored about individuals, hence the gray area we're talking about here today. So firstly, let's look at the negative impacts of this. The first one is the privacy of data, as just mentioned. Okay, just because the data is stored on the system does not mean everyone who works for that business has the right to see that data. Okay, and if it is things related to financial data and medical information, that should be kept extremely private, with only those who need to interact with the system at that level being able to view the data. Secondly, is the idea of too many cooks. If you've got too many users accessing and editing the same data, it can lead to users overriding each other. Okay, so we do need to make that only specific people can access specific records so that they're not overriding other people's works. And then finally is time and administration. Accessing rights take time to plan and to set up. So not just to set up, you've got to logically plan who has the rights to see information and then set that up with the system. And this could be a constantly changing thing. And every time new information is added to a system, you've obviously got to evaluate, well, who can actually edit this data? Okay, usually a good organization will have a certain structure, will say, well, this person's got this level of admin rights, and then this individual who's an executive has the highest level of rights and they can see everything. It'd be set up in some way, but it does take time to set that up. Finally, we'll look at the positive impacts related to this issue. And the first one is we're protecting privacy. That's what this is all about. By limiting who can access data, you're ultimately limiting who can view the data, protecting the privacy of individuals of whom the data is about. Okay, and so that's why we go to all this effort to put these things in place to protect the privacy of those individuals. And then finally is that controlled access. Different permissions enable users to have controls over what they can and can't do with data. This helps keeps access relevant to specific users, only using data for their required day-to-day work. Basically, if the data is irrelevant to you, you should not have access to that data. That's what organizations should be doing and setting it up in their workplace in order to protect that privacy of the individuals who your data is about. So I hope this video has given you a good introduction into access to data, ownership, and control, and really distinguish the difference between the three. Access being who has the right to view specific information, ownership being who actually owns the information, and control being what can they do with that information. So I hope this clears all that up.